And so let's just briefly recap all the things that we looked at. The first one, we looked at the difference between first degree murder, second degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. We talked about double homicide, triple homicide, mass murder, mass shooting, spree killing, serial killers. Okay, we talked about instrumental violence, that's premeditated, goal-driven violence versus reactive violence, hot-blooded violence that happens in the moment. Lecture 2, we talked about psychopaths and psychosis, be that delusional disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, all types. So now we've got the legal aspects and the categories together, and we've got an idea of some of the psychology. I'm going to rein it in just to basically looking at motive today. And motive is actually pretty interesting because often you'll hear law enforcement or web sleuths say, well, what is the motive for the murder? As if there's just one motive. I would argue that there's never really just a single motive for any human behavior. Human beings are really complex. And so I'm going to be taking you through a number of motives for why people commit acts of murder, or maybe even more generally, acts of violence. But there will always be sort of motives that connect to them, like a web of motives. And so maybe as we go along, I'll try and tease some of those more out. What I want to begin by doing is debunking the idea that there is senseless violence. Can you believe that senseless murder? I completely do not believe whatsoever in that concept, and I will debate all day with anyone who does. But let me give you the case of Gary Gilmore to, whoops, wrong direction, my bad. The case of Gary Gilmore. This is Gary. He left this planet in 1977 by way of firing squad. To illustrate what is considered to be a classic senseless murderer. So Gary Gilmore was a career criminal, armed robbery, acts of violence. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. It's like a milder form of psychopathy, focusing more on the impulsivity and criminal behavior parts, less on the charm. But Gary Gilmore, after getting out of prison in 1976 at the age of 22, on July 19th of that year, he walked into a gas station in Orem, Utah, and the clerk there was Max Jensen. Gilmore pulls a gun on him. He says, "All right, I want you to comply with my demands, lie on the floor, and I'm going to rob the place." Max Jensen completely complies. He doesn't give Gary Gilmore any trouble whatsoever. Gilmore takes the money and shoots him in the back of the head anyways. Seems pretty senseless, right? That's why people said that. The next day, July 20th, Gilmore goes into a motel in Provo, Utah, and the clerk there, Billy Bushnell, same thing. "I'm robbing you. Cooperate. Get on the floor, lie face down." Okay. Bushnell cooperates. He lies face down. Gilmore takes the money, shoots him anyways. So if you know what we're talking about a spree killer now. We know that from lecture 1. But what is the motive here? Like, you got the money. You didn't need to kill the guy. It's a senseless act of violence. Well, I think by the time we're halfway through this particular lecture, you're going to see that there is indeed sense to it. In fact, it's a very human crime, albeit brutal and a terrible one. People kill for all kinds of reasons. You may remember this example from the first lecture, and I gave it as the example of somebody who commits a double murder. Susan Smith. On October 25th, 1994, in Union County, South Carolina, Susan took her sons Michael, 3 years old, and Alexander, age 14 months, put them in a car, locked the doors, and rolled that car into John D. Long Lake, where both of her little boys drowned to death. She then called the authorities. She said, help, a black man carjacked my vehicle, and he took off with my 2 sons. And the community was very distressed by this. They were looking for this man. But the cops were looking at Susan and her affect, the way she seemed to cry, but there were no tears coming down her face. The way that there were inconsistencies in her stories. Things that she said happened that just simply couldn't have happened. And they piled on the pressure. And by November 3rd of that year, they got her to confess to what she did. But why did she do it? Well, the answer is pretty terrifying. Susan had been having an affair with a wealthy businessman, and he had sent her a letter, I believe. And in the letter, it said something to the effect of, I don't really want to be with you because there are aspects about your life that I just don't want as a part of mine. And specifically, I'm talking about your children. So whereas most people would say, okay, well, I don't want to be with a man who doesn't want to be with my children. Or if they really did, they might say, okay, well, maybe I'll give custody to my husband, or I'll put them in, I'll adopt them out. No, she solves this problem by drowning her two sons in the car and then staging it to look like something else happened in her mind to get with this guy. So we could say that she's killing because it's convenient to get these kids out of the way. At the same time, there's a love angle to it. And, you know, maybe she is somewhat motivated by the fact that this guy is wealthy. So that's something that we have to consider too. This one is particularly interesting. I'm going to give you the crime. I bet you don't guess the motive. So this happens in 1949 in Quebec, Canada. The perpetrator, well, let's say the mastermind of the operation, is 30-year-old Albert Gay. On September 9th, 1949, he convinces a woman who owes him debt, who is indebted to him, Marguerite Pete, to put a package on Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 108. It's flying from Montreal to Bay de Como with a stopover in Quebec City. And it's during this Quebec City stopover that she puts this luggage on the plane. And she's noticed by witnesses. She's wearing all black. So they refer to her later on as the Raven. Now, the package that she puts on is a clockwork bomb. I think it was filled with dynamite. So the mechanisms are clockwork, but the actual thing that ignites is dynamite. And it's supposed to be timed to blow up over the water so that there's absolutely no evidence. But best laid plans of mice and men, murders never go as you expect them to. Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder is a great example of that if you want to see a film about it. And it blows up over land, over a place called Sault-au-Cochon. 23 people die. That's pretty much everyone on the plane. 19 passengers and 4 crew. So you got to ask yourself, well, what's Albert Gay's motive to blow up a plane and kill 23 people? Is it terrorism? It sounds like terrorism, right? I mean, that's when we hear about planes blowing up, that would be what it would seem to be. Like, so is there some sort of political statement to this? Is it that he's some kind of pyromaniac? You know, he's just likes to kill for the thrill of it? No. Believe it or not, Albert Gay blows up this plane, killing 23 people, because one of the passengers is his wife, Rita Morel Gay. And he has been dating his mistress, Marie-Ange Robitaille, and he wants to get out of his marriage with Rita, and he wants to do it quickly without having to pay out any money or go through the divorce proceedings and move in with his mistress. He also wants to collect all the insurance money for his wife. So he just thinks for himself, well, you'd have to be a real psycho to blow up a whole plane just to kill your wife. So I'm going to do that, and then no one's going to suspect me, right? Because who would do that? And he shows up at the funeral for his wife, and he's making a big show, just like Susan Smith, of crying and crying and crying and crying. And no one suspects him, but eventually they identify the woman in black as Marguerite Pete, the woman who owes him money. And they find out that her brother is a clockmaker, Genereux Ruist. He's the guy that made the explosive device for Albert Gay. Now, Genereux Ruist, he's crippled. He's an old man. He says, Albert told me that he just needed it to blow up tree stumps. And so that's why I made it for him. And I believe that to be true. Albert Gay was a consummate con man. So Unfortunately, the jury and the criminal justice system didn't believe that. And General Ruiz, this poor crippled clockmaker, he was hanged to death. And I think it was a botched execution. It went really badly. Marguerite Pete, she's hanged to death, last woman to be hanged in Canada as a result of this crime. And then finally they get to Albert Gay, and they hang him on January the 12th, 1951. His last words are, "At least I die famous." So what we're looking at here is something that on the surface doesn't seem to be a profit-motivated crime, but really it is. He wants to collect on the insurance for his wife, and he wants to save on paying out alimony for divorce. But there's, like I said, there's never one motive. He also wants to get with this mistress who actually, as it turns out, even before he's found to be guilty of the crime, when his wife dies, he comes to his mistress and he says, "Now that my wife is dead, we can be together." She's like, "I don't want to be together with you." That was before she even knew that he was a murderer. So, yeah, pretty interesting there. So we've looked at convenience and profit. How about this one? I think a lot of people can relate to. It may be one of the most common motives for any type of violence, particularly homicide, and that is the act of revenge. Now, not that this guy here was convicted in a criminal court for taking revenge against his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, but he was found guilty in a civil court. So let's talk about O.J. Simpson, who at the age of 46, according to the civil court, on June the 12th, 1994, went to Brentwood, Los Angeles, and stabbed his 35-year-old estranged wife, Nicole, to death, cut her neck so hard that he almost decapitated her, and killed Ron Goldman, a 25-year-old friend of hers. We're not really exactly sure of their relationship to this day. Now, they had divorced the year before, 1993, and they had a history of domestic abuse. So he's a very jealous, controlling man. And it's this idea that she would call the police on me, she would divorce me, she would go out and have fun without the great OJ with another guy. Well, nobody does that to OJ. I'm about to get my revenge. So this is like, according to the civil courts, OJ did it, not the criminal courts, and it was motivated by the act of revenge. And we can say that jealousy and revenge can be kind of closely knit there. When we talk about revenge, sometimes it is against a specific person. Do you remember we watched this guy convicted of voluntary manslaughter in the first lecture? This is Gary Plauché. Jeff Doucette here molested his son walking through Baton Rouge Airport. Watch the phone booths here. Points a gun to his head. I had to cut it off there for obvious reasons, but fires a shot into his temple and kills him. Well, he was motivated to kill Jeff Doucette because Jeff Doucette had abducted his son Jody, repeatedly raped and molested him. And when asked, "Why did you do it, Gary?" he says, "I did what any father would have done." He's taking revenge against a specific individual who has done something wrong to him. It's a pretty good motive. But then you get other types of revenge, people who feel that they are shunned from society, that they're not a part of it. And their revenge is more general. It might be revenge against everyone else in the world for not letting them in to their parties or into their social circle, or, you know, in this case, not wanting to sleep with them. You all know this guy, but it's time to watch him in Sansar and in virtual reality, and pay close attention to the words that he uses and the way he describes himself.
Tell me. Tell me. I am behind you. I am behind you. Can you hear me? I am behind you.
Can't hear anything.
How do you talk? But doesn't everyone hear what you say?
Yeah, so that's why I speak very quietly. Huh?
Come on.
Hello, Francine. Francina?
In truth, the superior one.
Hello, can you hear the video?
No, I don't think anyone can hear the video.
Oh, thanks. Cause I thought because I talked, so I got like bent. You know what I mean?
Hi, Don. Can you close your mic, please? We're in the middle of a lecture.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All look down upon me every time I try to go out and join them. They've all treated me like a mouse. Well, now I will be a god compared to you. You will all be animals. You are animals, and I will slaughter you like animals. I'll be a god, exacting my retribution on all those who deserve it. And you do deserve it, just for the crime of living a better life than me.
I will slaughter all of you on the day of retribution. I will take my revenge against mankind, all for the crime of you having lived a better life than me. This is a different type of revenge than the Gary Plauché or even the O.J. Simpson revenge. This is some mass murder thinking here. By the way, when that video was filmed and released to the world on May the 23rd, 2014, Roger had already killed his two roommates and their friend. He had stabbed them multiple times, excessively, really rage-driven crimes. And then he had gone in his BMW and filmed that. After that video, he took a 9mm handguns. Then he drove around Isla Vista. He went to the sorority house, Alpha Phi, which he talked about, and knocked on the door, and nobody answered. So he got kind of cock-blocked on his misogynistic murder rampage. So then he just started shooting random people. He killed 6 in total and injured 14 using the guns and the BMW, and then eventually killed himself. Now, before we move on here, I think it's really interesting to think about how he spoke about himself. So he calls himself, "I'm still a virgin, inferior." He says, but I will become a god. I will become a true alpha male. And in some ways, we can actually look at God and think, well, God is the alpha male, right? So it's this act of this is what I am. But when I commit murder, this is what I'm going to become. And that's going to clear up all of the rage and frustration and depression I have in my life. So it's about revenge. And there's a sexual element in that, a revenge against being excluded from sexual and romantic life. But there's also issues of identity going on in there too. So this is actually from my doctoral dissertation. I call it the expressive transformative progress of violence. And let's take it through this with Roger, okay? So his actual own self, who he actually believes that he is. Well, what did he say? He said inferior. He said, I'm a virgin. He believes that he's a true gentleman. That's part of it. It's not all negative, but generally has a pretty poor self-image. And he wants to become other things. And I can't go through his whole biography, but he tries to be all these other things, these ideals that he aspires to. But he's so thin-skinned that he quits whenever there's any obstacle. And this plunges him into a period of crisis, depression, frustration. He retreats from life by playing World of Warcraft constantly. No offense to any of you out there who may have done this, but this is a pattern with him. He keeps trying new identities and failing at them because he has no resilience and plunging into crisis. And finally, he's had enough and he says, well, now I'll commit a murder, homicidal, ideal lone self, and I will become like a god. I will become the true alpha male. So what we're seeing here is a transformation of identity of the self from something weak and something that he actually believes he is, and he believes others believe he is, that he can't abide, to true alpha male, dominant, man of violence, man of action. And in this case, there's usually a few things that happen. But in the case of Roger, he kills himself immediately. He goes to suicide. And you can see that as almost like sealing the gate. Okay, he doesn't want to take the chance that he might go to prison and then lapse back into having an identity crisis, feeling bad about himself or still feeling like a loser. So he just says, I'm going to become a god, a true alpha male, then I'm checking out. The book is closed. I end on a high note. But they don't all go like that. Okay, you see at the bottom there, I'm probably in the way. Another way is to go to a reconciled self where, they commit these sort of murders and then they feel complete. They finally have an identity. They are whole at last. And then in a lot of cases, predictably, they plunge back into depression. So what I found then is that they will be depressed in jail and then go to suicide, or they'll reach something that I call the penitent self. And we're going to see that in the case of Mark David Chapman, who I argue kills almost exclusively for identity, although there's a jealousy component in there too. This is Mark David Chapman. We talked about him in the first lecture. On December 8th, 1980, he took a 38 special, waited outside the Dakota building in New York City, where the Beatle John Lennon lived. And then he waited till Lennon passed him, fired 5 times at him, hit 4 times with hollow point bullets in the back, killing John Lennon. And the question is, why does he do this? Well, immediately after killing John Lennon, he pulls out The Catcher in the Rye, which is a book written in 1951 by J.D. Salinger. And it's about an alienated young man who hates the world and thinks that it's full of phonies. And so he goes to a trip to New York City, and it's kind of like a coming-of-age tale, but a lot of alienated people have really related to this book. Chapman isn't the only one. John Hinckley, who shot President Ronald Reagan, was a Catcher in the Rye fan. And the protagonist of The Catcher in the Rye is a character called Holden Caulfield. So if you think about that process of building your identity through homicide, which I made a case for with Elliot Rodger, then let's listen to what Chapman has to say about his crimes 12 years after the fact. And I'll make it pretty clear for you through this video. So his actual self, who did he think he was? A nobody.
Back then, I was lost, and I didn't know who I was, but now I do.
All right. But so it was you, but the personality of you is different now.
Well, I didn't have a personality then, and I do now.
All right, who was Mark David Chapman?
Mark David Chapman at that point was a walking shell who didn't ever learn how to let out his feelings of anger, of rage, of disappointment. Mark David Chapman was a failure in his own mind. He wanted to become somebody important, Larry. He didn't know how to handle being a nobody. He tried to be a somebody through his years, but people stalk celebrities, and this is just my opinion. I haven't studied psychology, because they have nothing inside of themselves. Their esteem is rock bottom, and they feel that by writing fan letters or actually coming in close contact with the celebrity, they feel important. I know that I did some of those things before the thought of John Lennon or killing John Lennon came into my mind. I went to an art gallery, and Robert Goulet was there, and Leslie Nielsen was there, and I just wanted to be around them, and I had my picture taken with Robert Goulet. I don't think this has ever come out. And I felt important while I was with them. And then after, you disintegrate again. You become nothing. So if you have nothing to start with, and your life consists of fantasizing about celebrities or being with them, that can become very dangerous. And that is a phenomenon in this country now that has to be addressed. That's why the Secret Service has been talking with me and other people to try to find out what was ticking in this thing here on that night and before. I'm meeting with them Friday, by the way.
Okay, so who does he become? What's his version of the true alpha male?
Mark David Chapman struck out at something he perceived to be phony, something he was angry at, to become something he wasn't, to become somebody.
Holden Caulfield.
I left the hotel room, bought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, signed it to Holden Caulfield from Holden Caulfield, and wrote underneath that, "This is my statement," underlining the word "this," the emphasis on the word "this."
J.D. Salinger, who has not been heard from in years, he's reclusive, wrote Catcher in the Rye, a book read by millions, admired by millions. I wonder what he must be thinking as he, if he is, watching this. Mark, why are you blaming a book?
I'm not blaming a book. I blame myself for crawling inside of the book, and I certainly want to say that J.D. Salinger and The Catcher in the Rye didn't cause me to kill John Lennon. In fact, I wrote to J.D. Salinger. I got his box number from someone, and I apologize to him for this. I feel badly about that. It's my fault. I crawled in, found my pseudo-self within these pages.
In Holden.
And played out the whole thing.
But Holden wasn't violent.
Holden wasn't violent, but he had a violent thought of shooting someone, of emptying a revolver into this fellow's stomach, someone that had done him wrong. But you're right, he was a basically very sensitive person, and he probably would not have killed anybody as I did, but that's fiction, and reality was standing in front of the Dakota.
After Lennon is murdered, this new homicidal identity becomes tenuous. He plunges into depression.
In the power of the Lord now for a number of years.
He needs a new self.
Today, I'm different. I read the Bible, I pray, and I walk with him. He forgives me. He doesn't condone what I did, and that's a very important thing. He didn't like what I did 12 years ago. He didn't like all the pain I caused everybody, and especially John's widow. But he forgives me, and he hears me, and he listens to me, and he is the one, all these years, that has brought me out of the abyss, not medications or counseling. I've basically had to counsel myself through these years. Not that it's non-available here, but I've been very private about this. This is not anything that's easy to live with.
How do you know it isn't a crutch?
Well, in a way, it's got to be a crutch, because we all need a crutch. Life is not easy, and life for me isn't easy. And therefore, I think the Lord has a tender spot in his heart for prisoners. He said so. The rest of the Bible says so in many different places. And I've leaned on him. If it's a crutch, I've been leaning on a crutch, but it's a crutch made out of the cross, because without that, I probably wouldn't be alive today, because I was very suicidal, and I certainly wouldn't be in a well state of mind, not without him.
Okay, so it's in many ways the same sort of process as an Elliot Rodger. Chapman, number one there, his actual own self. I'm a nobody. I'm a nothing. I kept trying to be a somebody, as you can see throughout his emergent selves, his ideal self, but he can't. He keeps plunging into depression, crises of identity, and his homicidal ideal, where it's the true alpha male avenger. And that's something that is, I don't know, let's say it's a little bit more of an archetype, but in the case of Chapman, it's something specific. It's a character out of a novel, and that novel being The Catcher in the Rye. He's Holden Caulfield, the character from The Catcher in the Rye. But whereas Rodger immediately kills himself, in the case of Chapman, he said, I became suicidal afterwards. You know, it wasn't a tenable identity. So there, when you see number 8 there, he goes back into crisis. This doesn't resolve his identity crisis. It's when he becomes a penitent Christian, right up top there, number 9, the penitent self. That's the identity that he arrives at and that he still has today. So I think in most acts of violence or homicide, this identity, who am I? What kind of person do I want to be, and what kind of person do I not want to be? You know, that plays in a lot. It's going to be right of the crime. And so then we return to Gary Gilmore at the start of this. Remember, we were talking about career criminal, 35, just gets out of jail. And then on July 19th, 1976, robs a gas station, tells Max Jensen, get on the floor, lie face down, I won't hurt you, shoots him back in the head. The next day, he does the same thing to a motel clerk. Senseless. That's what everyone says. It's senseless, okay? Well, what if we look at it through this idea of identity? What if I tell you now that Gary Gilmore had been in a relationship after coming out of prison? He tried to walk the line, and he kept slipping back into heavy drinking, drug use, criminal acts, and that preceding those crimes, that his girlfriend, Nicole, had broken up with him, and that when he shot that gas station attendant in the back of the head, seemingly for no reason, he said, "This is for Nicole," almost like he's a character in a movie. It's very strange. Did you know also that this case is so popular, so well known, well publicized, because there was a moratorium on the death penalty. It might have actually even been banned in the United States for a period of time. And Gary Gilmore was sentenced first man to die upon the reinstatement of the death penalty. And so he was found guilty of these crimes in the court. And they said, Gary, you can hang or you can have a firing squad. And he said, I picked the firing squad. I want to be shot to death. And so the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, along with a number of religious leaders and other people, they come out and they said, this is wrong. We can't be executing people in the United States of America. You know, we've got to save Gary. And they're doing political actions to save him. And his he goes on the media and he says, he talks about the ACLU and all these religious leaders, and he says they always want to get in on the act. I don't think they've ever really done anything effective in their lives. I'd like all of them, including that group of reverends and rabbis from Salt Lake City, to butt out. It's been sanctioned by the courts that I die, and I accept that. He wanted to die. He was saying, like, "Oh, okay, you want me? Okay, I'm so badass. I don't even want to be saved. Bring it on." When he's executed, July 7th, 1977, his last words are, "Let's do it." I'm going to argue to you these senseless crimes of Gary Gilmore are actually about Gary Gilmore's identity. Okay, he sees himself as an outlaw. I'm a badass. I'm like a character from a movie. I'm like Clyde Barrow. Okay, and nobody saves me. Okay, I'm not afraid of nothing. So you sentence me to die? I don't care. That's what happens to criminals. No, no. He's getting. Yeah, he shows up half an hour ready to get set up, and this is why. Okay, it's all good. Yeah. So, yeah, going through that whole idea of identity, right? And Gary Gilmore committing these crimes where he shoots the guys in the back of the head after he's robbed them, and everyone's like, it's got no sense to it. As I said, I hope you caught this part, but he had broken up with his girlfriend just before committing these crimes, and he was not really feeling like much of a man. And it's like immediately after that he goes out and he commits these. He actually, and this makes no sense at all. When he kills this first clerk, shoots him in the back of the head, he says, "That's for Nicole." That's the girl that he broke up with, almost like something out of a movie, because this guy has no link to Nicole. So what's going on here? Anyways, so keep that in mind. He's sentenced to death for these crimes. He chooses firing squad. And then the ACLU and all these religious leaders start coming forward and they're saying, like, don't execute him. I mean, we've had a moratorium on the death penalty. We shouldn't be doing this. We're a civilized country. Gary Gilmore responds to their efforts by making the following statement to the media. He says, of the ACLU and all these religious leaders, he says, quote, "They always want to get in on the act. I don't think they've ever really done anything effective in their lives. I'd like all of them, including that group of reverends and rabbis from Salt Lake City, to butt out. This is my life. This is my death. It's been sanctioned by the courts that I die, and I accept that." When he was executed on January 17th, 1977, his last words are, "Let's do it." Believe it or not, this inspired the Nike logo, "Just Do It." That's a fact. The company admitted to that. But what is this saying about Gary Gilmore? Like, there's people who are going, "No, don't kill him. We shouldn't be doing this. It's not right. He's a troubled person." And he's saying, "Hey, I'm a badass, man. I'm a criminal. I accept the court's decision. Come on, kill me. I'm not afraid. Butt out. This is none of your business. Let's do it. Let's do it. Shoot me. Let's do it." So these senseless murders, really, they're about his identity. He sees himself, or he wants to see himself, as an outlaw, as a badass, as like a character from a movie, like a Clyde Barrow, a lawless, ungovernable man who is not afraid of death. So if you only look at a surface level, you might say, yeah, those crimes are senseless. But when you look at them as reinforcing who he wants to be, all of a sudden, aha, there it is. The whole time it was about Gary Gilmore trying to find himself. So we're halfway through, and I think that we found some sense in Gilmore's senseless crimes. I want to give credit actually to the criminologist Jack Katz. He wrote in his book, The Seductions of Crime, about that case, and he made the argument. I'm just repeating it here for you. There's no such thing as a senseless crime. There's plenty of crimes that are motivated by sex. You have one type we sometimes kind of crudely known as the rape slayer, and this is a rapist who's primarily motivated to rape, but he doesn't want to leave witnesses. And David Carpenter, the trailside killer in San Francisco from 1979 to 1981, is a good example of this. He killed 7 to 10 people, maybe even more. And he would hang around these trails around the San Francisco area, and he would wait for women to come by. Even every once in a while, it would be a woman and a man. He would pull out his gun, a .38, and he would order them to, you take control of them using the gun. He would rape the woman, and then if he would kill whoever was involved, just eliminating the witnesses. So this is a type of sex crime where we can almost see it as like a killer rapist. And you might think, well, isn't that what sex crime is? Well, no, not actually. You also have guys like Albert Fish. Okay. This guy is widely considered to be the most perverted man in history, at least the most perverted criminal. Albert Fish killed and molested countless children of both sexes in the early part of the 20th century. We know that he did 3 in New York City. He killed Francis McDonald on Staten Island, 1924. Francis was only 9. He strangled him with his own suspenders and started to attempt to castrate the boy, but was scared off when a witness came along. 1927 in Long Island, Brooklyn specifically, he gets Billy Gaffney, only 4 years old. He abducts him from an apartment complex. He takes him to a place, an abandoned building by the dump, and he ties him to the bed there. And he tortures him for days, mutilates him, whips him, probably rapes him, just inflicts pain on this poor little boy. And we'll get to what he eventually does with him when we get to the final story. His most famous crime is the abduction of Grace Budd, who was about 9 or 10 years old in Manhattan in 1928. And Albert Fish answers a classified ad in a local New York newspaper. Someone from the Budd family, it's a young man, and he wants to get out of the city for the summer, so he's looking for someone to employ him on a farm so he can go out and do some work. Well, Albert Fish sees this ad and thinks, oh, okay, well, I can lure this young man into my clutches and do what I do to all of my victims to him, all these terrible tortures and mutilations. But when he goes there, the young man isn't there, and he's invited in. He's pretending to be a guy called Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer who has a farm on Long Island. And as he's waiting for, I think it's Edward Budd, the boy who put the classified ad in the newspaper, he starts to hear a whistling down the hallway. And it's Grace Budd. Like I said, she's 9 or 10 years old, and she's just a little sweetheart of a little girl. And that's when he changes his mind. He says, no, I want her instead. So he convinces the family that he's going to come back the next day or in the coming days to pick up Edward and bring him to the farm. But he says, in the meantime, did you know that my granddaughter or niece is having a birthday party tonight? And I think little Grace here would really like to come. And the parents, mom's a little concerned, but they're a poor family. Dad says, you know what? She doesn't get to have much fun in her life. Why don't we just let her go to the party? Okay, what's the address? He gives the address, and he walks off with Grace. And the Budd family never see Grace again. Of course, after she doesn't return that night, they start to panic. They look into the address. They find the address doesn't exist. This is 1928. Years pass. And then in November of 1934, the Budd family receive a message. Delia Budd, Grace's mother, can't actually read. So she has to have her son read it out to her. The letter reads, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak chops or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, 1 7, 1 11. Took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times a day and night he spanked them, tortured them to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven. Boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. I told her to remain outside when we got there. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have, had I wished. She died a virgin. So let me break this down. He took Grace Budd, stripped down naked, strangled her to death, chopped her into pieces and ate her. This was a sexual act. It's called anthropophagy. We're going to talk about that more in Lecture 5 when we get into fetishes and paraphilia. But the point is that sex crimes don't necessarily have to be something like raping someone. People can derive sexual pleasure from all kinds of crazy deviant acts. And actually writing that letter in itself to Mrs. Budd was probably a turn on to Albert Fish. He had more documented fetishes and paraphilia at the time than I think anyone in history. Among them, sadism, masochism, infibulation. That's, I believe that's inserting needles into yourself. They did an x-ray of his pelvis. They found that he had something like 21 rusty needles in his own pelvis. Flagellation, he would get off sexually whipping himself. Pedophilia, clearly. Exhibitionism, exposing himself to people. Voyeurism, peeking in the windows at people. Piquerism, shallow stab wounds that cause pain. Okay, coprophagia, eating feces, urophilia, attraction to urine, scatologia, writing obscene letters. These were just some of all the crazy things that turned Albert Fish on. And when he was electrocuted at Sing Sing on January 16th, 1936, he was actually not scared of the death penalty at all, kind of like Gary Gilmore. Because he was a masochist, because he enjoyed pain and humiliation, he said, well, this will be the greatest thrill of all, being electrocuted. So you can even punish this man. He got sexual pleasure from being punished and humiliated. So David Carpenter, killer rapist, Albert Fish, paraphilic lust murderer, both motivated by sex, but very different in some ways, even though both are serial killers. Then we have psychosis, bouts of schizophrenia or delusional disorder that go too long can cause someone to kill someone. This is the infamous Winnipeg bus murderer in Canada. There was a trip on a Greyhound bus across Winnipeg in Canada, and this guy sat down next to a carnival barker called Tim McLean. Tim was 22. He had his Insane Clown Posse on, his headphones, and he was just kind of not paying attention to the guy, trying to sleep. How one sleeps to Insane Clown Posse, I don't know, but that's kind of besides the point, because this man here, Vince Lee, who sits beside him, takes out a knife, stabs Tim to death. The bus stops. Everyone starts pouring off the bus, including the driver. He cuts Tim's head off and cuts pieces off him and starts to eat them. So we've got cannibalism again. But it's not the same as Albert Fish, because he's not doing it for sexual reasons. He's doing it because he's having a full-blown psychotic episode. He thinks Tim sitting next to him is a demon. He sees him as a demon. He's hallucinating. And he goes, okay, I'm going to have to kill this guy and eat him in order to stop the demon from regenerating. So that's why he does what he does. He's obviously found not criminally responsible. We were talking before about the idea of guilt or not guilty being a legal concept. Well, he's not guilty because he's insane. And he's actually let out of the psychiatric facility in 2015 and hasn't reoffended since. We also talked about briefly, same deal, I think it was last lecture, we talked about the two girls that tried to sacrifice their friend for Slender Man. Now, what interests me is you have guys here like Paul Hill. Paul Hill was a Christian fundamentalist who killed an abortionist and his bodyguard in Pensacola, Florida, with a Mossberg shotgun. And he did it because he believed that the laws of God superseded and trumped the laws of man, and that it was incumbent upon him to be a good Christian and to please God and to go to heaven to defend the unborn. Okay? You have Mohammed Sadiq Khan, one of the 7/7 bombers, who blew up the London Underground with 3 accomplices. And he was motivated to do this also for religious reasons, steeped in radical interpretations of Islam. And so without getting too much into religion here, I find it really interesting that there's about equal proof for the existence of a God as there is for Slender Man. But when little girls try and sacrifice someone for Slender Man and to go and live in Slender Man's mansion, we say, well, they're psychotic, they're insane. But when the two people I've just discussed do it based on the commands of a God, their interpretation through scripture, we don't think that that's insanity. We just say that's a religiously inspired homicide. Well, let's look what they have to say about their motives.
I was playing with my children and watching them and watching my wife, and walk along the beach. And I took each one of the children one by one out into the surf, over their heads. And I was supporting each one and holding them in the water. And it occurred to me that I was making a sacrifice. It was thinking about the promise made to Abraham that if he was willing to sacrifice his son, that God would grant him descendants as numerous as the sands of on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And I just laid hold on that promise, there was a real, the emotions were so powerful, it was difficult to keep tears from coming to my eyes. And I just lifted my heart up and prayed.
Paul Jennings Hill is hereby sentenced in count 1 to death. The murder of Dr. John Maynard Britton is hereby sentenced in count 2.
When the prosecution first announced they were going to be seeking the death penalty, the heightened threat definitely served to increase my joy. It really did.
Did you guys lose audio?
And because the prospect of possibly dying.
Okay, I don't know what's going on, but
children,
there we go.
It was a wonderful prospect. Still, it continues to be.
All Muslims are bred. You day in and day out on your TV sets, watch and hear about the oppression of the Muslims from the east to the west. But yet you turn a blind eye and cut it.
Okay, well, audio's fading in and out. I'm not really sure why that is, but I'll just summarize it for you. I think I made the point with the case of the first guy. And the second guy, it's the idea that Muslims are being attacked overseas, and a Muslim is in the Quran must defend the Ummah. That's the greatest. That's the greater Muslim community. And if you don't do that, you're not being truly faithful according to this particular interpretation. And so if you do this and you die in combat attacking those who attack the Ummah, you become a martyr. a jihadist, and you automatically get a free ticket to paradise. Any sins that you've committed, and believe me, it's very easy to sin in Islam. Before that time, it's wiped clean. You get a clean bill. So if you believe in these religious interpretations, in many ways, it's like believing in the Slender Man thing. It makes sense, given that framework, to commit that act of violence. And that's what I think is particularly dangerous about that level of certainty and devotion to any ideology, be it religious or secular. And we'll get into the secular ones. This guy here is the assassin of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1994, Yigal Amir. Rabin had decided to give the West Bank to the Palestinians, and using a Jewish concept called din rodef, Yigal Amir reasoned that by doing so, Rabin was endangering the lives of Jewish people, and so therefore it was okay to murder him because he was endangering the religious community. Actually, in some ways, it's very similar to the reasoning we saw of Mohammed Sadiq Khan. And so, he shot the prime minister of Israel and killed him, and is still in prison today. And, you could say it's political, but the political and the religious are often very closely knit. But we can look at other ideologies. So here is the Thuggee cult in India. These were actually wiped out by the British, but in the 19th century, they would meet travelers on the road, and they would strangle them around the campfire and bury their bodies ritualistically, and they would offer this up as sacrifices to the Hindu goddess Kali, who was like one of the manifestations or related to Shiva, the god of destruction. In Africa, to this day, we have witch doctors who practice a type of magic called muti, in which they need people to go out and to castrate a living boy, okay? Not even a dead boy, not even kill a boy and then cut his genitals off, but just cut his genitals off while he's still alive. And then they can use those body parts in spells. So belief taken to the extremes can be extraordinarily dangerous. Of course, this also goes for secular beliefs like race. Dylan Roof shoots up a church in Charlottesville, South Carolina, June 7, 2015. It's Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. He kills 9 people and injures another. And essentially, he was a white separatist. He bought into a kind of secular nonsense that is about the supremacy of the white race, and he looked into Nazism and into South African apartheid, and he saw the killing of Trayvon Martin to be a grave injustice. He thought that Trayvon Martin was being sort of canonized, and that this wasn't right, and that the black people were going to take over America. So based on a completely secular but ridiculous ideology, he commits this terrible crime. And, it's not just him. You have the zebra murderers in San Francisco in 1973 and 74. And so this is JCX Simon. He is recently dead. He was one of them, but also Manuel Moore, Larry Green, Jesse Lee Cooks, and they called themselves the Death Angels. And from October 73 to April 74, they committed at least 15 murders. Some of them say as high as 93, and 8 attempted. All their victims were not black, the majority white, and they would just shoot them or chop them up with a machete, sometimes sexually assault the females. And I heard from somebody that knew of these guys. I think he was loosely associated them down the line. He said that they would have a point system. So if you killed a white man, you would get like 2 points. If you killed a white woman, you'd get, say, 4 points. If you killed a white child, you get like 8 points. Now, don't quote me on that, but that's the idea of of how racism can just drive people to violent acts. So can taking politics too seriously. Thomas Mayer here, okay, June 16th, 2016. He's 52 years old. This is in the UK, in West Yorkshire. There's a Labour MP, Jo Cox. She's pro-EU. She wants more immigration to the UK. This guy has an opposite opinion. Instead of casting his vote at the ballot box and letting democracy just take hold, he decides that she's destroying his country. So he approaches her during a public event, and he shoots her twice in the head and stabs her 15 times. Okay, this is an example of what I would call maybe nationalist, right-wing extremist violence. But look, it also happens on the left too. James Hodgkinson here. He went to a softball game for charity in Alexandria, Virginia. He was 66 at the time, June 14th, 2017. And he shows up and he says, "Is it the Democrats playing or the Republicans?" And someone says to him, "It's the Republicans." He goes, "Okay." He comes back with an SKS rifle and he just starts shooting them on the baseball pitch. He injures 6 people. So mass shooter, not mass murderer, but still injures 6 people, including Whip Steve Scalise. He's killed following a 10-minute shootout with the police. And when they look into his background on social media, he has these anti-Republican, anti-Trump screeds. He talks about Trump needing to be destroyed, removed. So extremism, it can go in any ways. It's the degree to which you believe in something, the degree to which you can use it to justify being a violent person. Loyalty, too, can be very dangerous, especially in a cult setting. Here you see Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, disciples of Charles Manson, okay, along with Tex Watson. They were sort of the main people who committed the Tate LaBianca murders in 1969. You will have recently seen a sort of dramatization, nearing that in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But I think that most of you know the Manson stories. And they're loyal to Charlie and Charlie's vision of what's going to happen. Charlie wants to start a race war. And so they kill these people because Charlie tells them to. And they write piggies and blood on the wall and Helter Skelter, which there's another Beatles reference. I mean, that's something interesting we can get into. That was a Beatles song. Helter Skelter is what Charles Manson thought would be an apocalypse in American society, a race war between blacks and whites, and they were trying to ignite it. So they're just following orders from Charlie. Basically, it can totally brainwash them. And the only thing that I can think of more sinister than that is the followers of Jim Jones. Jim Jones started off, he seemed like a good guy. He was a Christian. He was a preacher, cared very much about equality. He was very much not a racist. His church was a majority black congregants, and he thought that that they needed to create a perfect socialist utopia in Guyana. So he moved thousands of people from his church down to Guyana, and they built a town called Jonestown, named after him. And they ran it as a communist community. The problem was he becomes more and more obsessed with power, and people want to leave, and he's not letting them. Word gets back to the United States, to Congressman Leo Ryan in California. People start to hear, I have relatives that want to leave Jonestown, and Jim Jones won't let them. So Congressman Ryan flies down, and this would have been on, November 18th, 1978. And Congressman Ryan gets down and he's given a trip through Jonestown. Jim Jones instructs all of his followers, don't anyone tell him that you want to leave. We're all a happy family here. It's the perfect communist utopia. So I don't want to hear any of that. But after a little bit, when Congressman Ryan seems to think, this is a bit overreported, it seems to be okay, he starts getting slipped notes. And these notes are saying things like, actually, I'm not supposed to say this, but they won't let me leave here. Okay, I want to leave. And so he takes some of these people that want to leave and he heads back to the airstrip to fly out of there. Jim Jones hears about this. He sends some of his most devoted cult followers with semi-automatics, and they gun down the congressman, and they kill, I think it was 6 people on the Kaituma Airport Strip in Guyana. Now you've killed a U.S. congressman, okay? The end is coming. That's just not going to be allowed to fly. So what does he do? Does he just kill himself? No. He is the center of the universe to himself. And all those around him, he's been working on them so much, convincing them that he's so very special. And he's this Messiah-like figure. And that, like Jesus, he tried to bring peace to earth. But, here they are coming to crucify him metaphorically in the same way. So if we can't live in this world at peace together, we should leave this world in peace. We've done our best, and he actually uses this to convince 918 people either to commit suicide by drinking Kool-Aid with cyanide in it, or to squirt that same cyanide-laced Kool-Aid into the mouths of their children. And if you ever hear the audio tape of this, and you hear the screaming children in the background, and you hear Jim Jones saying, "Oh, it's just a little sour. It's not them being hurt. It's just like going to sleep." It's one of the most chilling things you'll ever hear. And why did this happen? Well, like Manson, it was out of loyalty to Jim Jones. Now, these are extreme examples. These are cults. Of course, people can kill out of loyalty to the Hells Angels or the Mafia or any type of organized crime. What I want to end with is you have here like the Zodiac Killer. He was never caught, but this is an illustration of him at Lake Berryessa when he appeared in this strange costume. We know that he wore this because one of his victims survived. He appeared while Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were lying on a picnic basket, a picnic blanket, enjoying a nice sunny day by this man-made lake. And he came out dressed like that. Can you imagine that? Just popping out of the trees. He's got a gun on you. And he says, "I just broke out of a prison in Montana. I need to tie you up. I need your car keys and I need your money." Okay, they say, "We'll go along with that. That's fine. Just don't hurt us." Once he has them tied up, he pulls out a knife and he stabs them. He kills Cecilia Shepard and he seriously hurts Brian Hartnell. Then he goes and he makes a phone call and he reports the murder to the police. And he actually writes, I think it was with marker on the victim's car, like his scorecard of the amount of people he killed. He'd killed at least 3 other people before this, always couples that he's targeting, shooting into their cars, and then sending letters to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald, calling himself the Zodiac. So if we think of all those motives, is there just one motive at play here with the Zodiac Killer? I think we can certainly say that identity is probably the most salient part. I mean, look, he's got a costume. He's got his own symbol. Do you think he's trying to declare, "I am Zodiac, I am not a loser," the same way that Elliot Rodger did, the same way that Gary Gilmore said, "I am outlaw, I am not a loser," the same way that Mark David Chapman said, "I'm not a nobody, I'm the catcher in the rye of my generation"? Yes, I would argue that that's happening, but maybe he also was enjoying some revenge, taking it out on young lovers, couples, maybe something he couldn't have had. Maybe he got a sexual thrill from hurting them. We know that he took some of their money. So to end this off, there's always a motive for murder. And oftentimes there are multiple motives and they all intermingle in a very complex web. And that's the way that I want you to look at crimes. When you look at a crime, don't just, if you can't find what the motive is, look harder, think harder. What's really going on? What's it about? And then once you found the motive, or you think you know the motive, ask yourself, what else is going on here? I'd like to thank you all so much for coming out to Lecture 3. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. And I guess now is a good time for the Q&A. Hold on. Oh, wait, hold on. We got next lectures. We got one on Wednesday, MO and signature. Then we're going to start looking at investigating homicides. There we go. Okay, questions. Yeah, this is pretty meta. We have John Lennon here in digital form, watching his assassin speak about killing him. Welcome to education in VR, everyone. So the floor is open. Questions, comments?
Praise?
Sorry, I heard something up there.
I said praise? Compliments?
I'll take that too.
Yeah. It was amazing. I don't have any questions, but all the stories were really fascinating.
Thank you. Can you think of any motives I might have missed? I really went through them all there. Obviously, ideology, whether it's religious, political, racial, gender, is a huge part of it. Sex, profit, convenience, identity, I think, runs through all of these things to some degree. But can you think of anything I might have overlooked? For murder, so we won't count self-defense.
What about fear?
Yeah, I suppose so. Like a sort of paranoid fear. Yeah, if you are not actually under threat, but you perceive that you are, and you think that others are coming to get you, certainly. Although that did play into the psychosis part a little bit, but you're right, fear is something entirely separate. So when I expand on this lecture, I'll try and find an example of that. Thank you for that.
You know, I thought it was interesting, the part about the way others look at you and your own self-image, the conflicts there.
Right.
It seems to be a common thing between many of them.
Yeah, exactly. That was actually the topic of my doctoral thesis. Is I would see behavior that you couldn't say was sexual, but it was weird. It was clearly something to do with a psychological aberration. And I said, this seems to be more about the identity of the perpetrator. And so I started with that and I traced it back. And that's how I came up with that whole process of what I call expressive transformative violent behavior. But yeah, I'm glad that you enjoyed that. That's kind of my first time ever actually lecturing on it to a group of people. I think it's really important and I'd like to do more work with it.
Yeah, when I heard that, I was like, it makes so much sense. You know, you think about it in your own life, you know.
Of course.
When you've had those real conflicts of yourself and who you are, you know.
Yeah, it's very human. And I think you can apply that to, as you said, people's lives in general. We don't always resolve things by committing murder. In the cases of these guys, they do, or at least they make an attempt to it. But you could also apply this to somebody who commits suicide.
Right, exactly.
Or any of the other things that you mentioned about people being desperate to find an identity for themselves that works.
Sorry, what was the first part of that? I think I missed it.
Like, also, I mean, without being as extreme as murder or suicide, any of the cases where people just seek an identity so hard that they keep switching ideologies or find more desperate acts to make themselves known to themselves or to other people.
I've heard of people who have gone from being like criminals, drug users, party animals to like absolute religious
Bye, everybody. Thanks,
devotees.
Professor.
Yeah, no problem. You enjoyed it. Bye. Have a good one. Yeah, I think we can all see people like this, that people that sort of go to extremes. And I wonder if it's almost like a psychological type, right? I'm aware of a guy who was a neo-Nazi who became an ISIS recruit. it seems to be a type of person that their emotions are so out of whack and they have such an unstable sense of self that they'll oscillate between conflicting identities. Like the thing I didn't tell you about Mark David Chapman before he, decided to become the catcher in the rye and kill the phony John Lennon is that he tried to be a hippie. And then he got robbed by some hippies on the beach, and then he disavowed that, and then he became like an ardent Christian who hated the Beatles, and then they wouldn't let him sing his Christian songs around the campfire, so he stopped being that. And then he became a YMCA counselor, and he won all these awards for that. He was doing great. He'd found what the rest of us would say, I've found myself. I finally found my place. People love me. They tell me I'm good at this. He gets one bit of criticism, he quits. He tries to kill himself, and eventually he arrives at this homicidal identity. So I know this is a long-winded answer to your question, Mad-Eye, but I just think that there are some people that they just can't have a stable identity, and they just always crashing and then coming up and trying to find something new, whether that results in murder or not. And what's interesting is so much about what we do here in Sansar and in online communities is about cultivating a virtual identity or an image. I imagine you could apply a lot of this theoretically to what we do in digital space.
I feel like
that's
this-
probably